Deltora Shadowlands, The Cavern of the Fear. Chapter 12. Mysteries. Barda bent over the hole, roaring furiously. But Lief, rapidly disappearing into the gloom, merely shouted to him to follow. Fury plainly had no intention of returning to ground level either. The chain around Barda's waist was pulling violently. There was only one thing to do. Barda scrambled into the hole himself, cursing under his breath. What was the boy doing? What had he seen in this foul burrow? Dirt and rotted leaves showered his face as he lowered himself to the earth, clinging to the tree roots that netted the sides of the hole. His feet scrabbled for footholds. His hands ached. When he looked up, he could see only a faint glimmer of light. "Take care," Lief's muffled voice floated upwards. "You are a fine one to speak of taking care," Barda shouted back. A moment later, his feet broke into space. He kicked out wildly, searching for a foothold. Something grabbed his ankles and he yelled. "I have you," Lief called. "Wait." With relief, Barda felt his feet guided to a firm surface. Slowly, he lowered himself out of the tunnel. The first thing he saw was Lief's face, wild with excitement and streaked with dirt. Then he moved his eyes downwards and stared. He was looking down at a vast space filled with thousands of huge grey poles that stretched from floor to ceiling. A gurgling stream lined with pale ferns wound its way through the poles, disappearing into the dimness. Then he realized what he was seeing, and his jaw dropped. "Why, they are giant trees," he breathed. "This is a forest beneath a forest. How could this be?" "I think the vine-weaver birds must have caused it," said Lief, touching the matted web of branches and vines above his head. "Once they live in the top of these trees, weaving their nests and eating berries. Over time, the forest canopy became so thick and tangled that it was almost solid. The berries the birds dropped did not fall to the ground, but were caught in old nests and the forks of branches. So the seeds took root, watered by the rain, and young trees grew on top of the old," said Barda. "And after hundreds of years, Lief finished for him, there was no sign of the old forest left, no sign of the valley in which it grew. Only the trees, the moths, and the birds above knew the secret." Barda became aware that Fury was tugging once more on her chain. She had moved down the tree as far as she could, and was now rearing and scrabbling in frustration because she could go no further. "We still do not know if Jasmine and Glock are here, or just Glock Spider," he said. Lief grinned. "What trees and birds know, Jasmine soon knows also," he said. "She and Glock have found this place, there is no doubt. Look." He pointed, and there, tied around the trunk of the tree and dangling almost to the ground, was a rope. It did not take long for Lief and Barda to reach the ground using the rope, but even this small delay drove Fury to distraction. The moment she was free to do so, she set off at a great pace along the stream. This time, Lief and Barda hardly needed her to show them the way. This time, Lief and Barda hardly needed her to show them the way to go. The ground was almost covered by fragile white fungus and patches of brittle fern. The tracks of two people were plainly visible, one set of heavy, large prints, one set of lighter, smaller ones. The air was heavy with the smell of earth and mold. There was no sound but the gurgling of the stream. The trees rose silent and ghostly around them, their trunks blotched with tongues of yellow fungus, from which hung squirming bundles of fat caterpillars. Clearly, the moths from the forest above used the hidden valley as a safe nesting place. Now and then, Lief or Barda called Jasmine's name, but no answering cry reached their ears. Slowly, a feeling of dread began to grow in Lief. Were they too late? Words from the girl with the golden hair echoed in his mind. She ran deep into the dragon's cave and down under the earth, into the caverns where the goblins live. Dragons have been extinct in Deltora for hundreds of years, said Barda, as if reading his mind. If there is a dragon's lair in this valley, it is empty. The forest would never have been covered over if this was not so. The dragon would have kept the canopy open by flying out to hunt every day. And the goblins, muttered Lief, are they extinct also? If they ever existed, said Barda. My mother used to tell a story of 7 goblins who prowled the countryside north of Del. But the tale always began once upon a time, as fairy stories do. I have heard Glock claim that one of his ancestors fought and killed a goblin, said Lief. Barda snorted. I have heard Glock claim many things, he said. They rounded a bend in the stream and saw ahead of them a rocky cliff, rising behind the trees like a wall. The stream ended in a small, deep pool at its foot. We have reached the forest's edge, whispered Barda. This must be the base of one of the hills we saw when we looked down from the other side. Lief nodded, his skin prickling as he saw that the footprint trail led away from the stream into a vast, dark cave in the cliff. Fury dashed ahead of them as they crept towards the cave's entrance. It was heavily fringed with ferns, and somehow this made it look even more like a gaping, toothless mouth. Inside, it was black as night and silent as the grave. Lief, Barda breathed. The ruby. Reluctantly, Lief pulled his cloak aside to reveal the jeweled belt. The rich red of the ruby seemed only a little dimmer. If there is danger, it is slight, Barda said, visibly relaxing. Lief wet his lips. I think we should still take care, he said slowly. The belt may not be as powerful here as it is on the surface. And look at Fury. Barda glanced downward. The huge spider was standing motionless and wary at his feet. They lit a torch. Then, shoulder to shoulder, swords drawn, they moved into the cave. The torch lit the ground immediately ahead, but thick darkness surrounded its warm, flickering glow. It was as though they were floating through a black sea in a small bubble of light. Lief felt as though he was moving in a dream. The air was heavy and warm, and slowly, a strange musky smell was growing in strength. There is something alive in here, he breathed. As he spoke, the torchlight flickered on something ahead, something huge. Scales gleamed golden amid dancing shadows. Teeth and claws glimmered white. A tail lay coiled, thick with spines as sharp as needles. Folded, leathery wings, netted with spiderwebs, trailed in the dust. A dragon. A deep, ancient dread welled up in Lief, turning his legs to jelly. He heard Barda draw a quick breath. The dragon did not stir. All that moved was the torchlight flickering over its huge form. Its eyes are shut. It is asleep or dead, Barda hissed. Not dead, I think, said Lief, struggling to calm himself. But not asleep either, or it would have sensed us and woken. This is some sort of enchantment. Fury began to creep to the left. As Lief and Barda went after her, the torchlight began to flicker on the cave's rocky wall. Soon, they saw that there was a narrow space between the wall and the dragon's head. This, then, was to be their path. Already, Fury was crawling doggedly through the gap. Taking a deep breath, Barda moved after her, looking straight ahead. Lief began to follow. He knew that he too should keep his eyes to the front, but he could not. He turned and gazed, fascinated, at the terrible head, so near that he had only to stretch out a hand to touch it. And as he stared, the dragon's great, golden eye opened. Lief froze. His mind went black. There was no fear, no hope, no thought. There was only the dragon's eye, and his own face mirrored there, pale, weak, and small, floating in a cold, flat sea that was gold as the topaz in the belt of Deltora, deep with ancient memory. For a long moment the eye held him, then, slowly, it closed once more. Released, almost sick with shock, Lief lurched onto where Barda was waiting for him. "Why did you stop?" Barda whispered. "Are you mad, Lief, that you would risk?" Lief brushed past blindly. Blackness yawned ahead, but that was better than what lay behind him. Cool air fanned his face, chilling the sweat on his brow. All he could think of was to get away and hide himself. He heard Barda hurrying after him, felt Barda trying to hold him back. There was another gust of cold air. The torch flared and went out. Lief stumbled, righted himself, and stepped forward into thin air. There was a split second of disbelief, and then he was falling, dragging Barda with him, plunging down, down into the darkness. Chapter 13. Gold and Scarlet. Deep, chill water holding him down. His lungs almost bursting, Lief fought his way to the surface. He floundered there, taking great gulps of air, looking blindly around him through a blur of water. "Barda!" he shouted desperately. However, only his echoes answered him, 1,000 echoes, calling and whispering from every direction. There was a sudden splashing nearby. Dizzy with relief, Lief heard Barda gasping and coughing. "Barda, I am here," he called, struggling towards the sound. As his eyes began to clear, Lief saw the shape of Barda's head, dark against water that moved like pale, liquid gold. He saw the soft glow of gold all around him, gold shining from the walls of a vast cavern that seemed to have no beginning and no end, gold as the dragon's eye, as the dragon's scales, gold as the great topaz. This was the cavern through which Elise fled in ages past. This was the place Jasmine had sought, the beginning of the underground way to the Shadowlands. But the old tale had not mentioned one important detail. The cavern was flooded, and Lief's stomach turned over, because Jasmine could not swim. Through a haze of misery, he saw Barda's arm reach out and catch hold of something that was bobbing in the water beside him. For a terrifying moment, Lief thought that it was a body. Then he realized that it was only a log of wood. He looked up. The shimmering roof of the cavern curved high above him, like a golden sky. The hole through which he and Barda had fallen was just a small, blurred patch of darkness. He could barely see it. There was no way he and Barda could reach it. Barda paddled over to him, half leaning on the log. "This will keep us afloat for a while at least," he panted, "until we find another way out. Or what?" Lief thought as his companion's voice faltered. "Until finally the wood grows waterlogged and sinks? Until we grow too exhausted to hold on to it any longer?" "The water may be more shallow further on," he said huskily. "Let us try." As he spoke, he saw movement around the corner of his eye. Something small and dark was wriggling towards them through the rippling water. Lief could hardly believe his eyes when he recognized the tangle of flailing legs and angry red stare for what they were. "Fury!" he exclaimed as the spider reached the log. Fury climbed laboriously from the water, still trailing a short length of chain. She reached the top of the log and crouched there, glowering, the picture of rage. Barda shook his head in disbelief. "I thought that, at least, I was rid of you, Spider," he growled. All the same, Fury's appearance had cheered both of them. Supporting themselves on the log, they began to paddle slowly forward. At first, they spoke to one another, marveling at the mysterious beauty of the place, even joking about Fury's continued sulking. But as the hours passed, the talk grew less, and at last they were silent. It was the silence of exhaustion, cold, and the gradual disappearance of hope. Leif's legs were numb. He no longer had the strength to paddle. He put his head down on the log, feeling its strange, spongy softness under his cheek. "Lief, hold on. You must not die." Barda's voice seemed very far away. Lief could not answer. His mind was drifting, floating. As he was drifting on the shining water, as his reflection had floated on the surface of the dragon's eye. Lief swam slowly up from the depths of a fainting sleep, with no idea of how much time had passed. He opened his eyes and blinked. The golden light had changed to scarlet. The very air seemed stained with red. He could hear the splashing of water and had the sense of rapid movement. Slowly, it came to him that he was in the bottom of a boat. Barda was lying beside him, and sitting in the center of a boat, dipping paddles into the water in fast, perfect time, were two strange-looking creatures. Their bodies were small but human. Probably when they stood up, they would be about as tall as gnomes, though they were far less stockily built. But they seemed totally hairless, and their heads and faces were dog-like, with long muzzles and large pointed ears. At first, Lief thought they were dressed in red and that their skin was red too. Then he realized that this was an illusion caused by the scarlet glow. In fact, the creature's skin was deathly pale, with a softness common to crawling things that live beneath the earth. Lief shuddered. These must be goblins, the ugly, spiteful creatures of old tales, though they did not look as he had imagined. Unwilling to reveal that he had woken, he watched through half-closed eyelids as the goblins paddled silently, their pale eyes staring straight ahead. It occurred to him that they were hurrying. There was urgency in their movements and their set faces. It must have taken some time for them to load Lief and Barda into their boat. Now it seemed they were late, or in some kind of danger. It was always said that goblins were creatures of evil will, yet this pair had saved him and Barda from drowning, even though they could ill afford the delay. Perhaps the goblins' evil reputation was false. Perhaps the few Deltorans who had seen goblins in the past ages had feared them simply because of their strange appearance. But as the thought came to him, Lief felt for his sword. It was missing. He turned his head and saw that Barda's sword, too, was gone. Squinting through the soft red light, he caught the glimmer of metal at the goblin's feet. He and Barda had been disarmed. Was this just a caution on the goblin's part, or did it mean something more sinister? A loud, rasping sound, like rock grating on rock, echoed through the cavern. The goblins both paused, their ears quivering, their faces alert. One murmured to the other. Then they both began paddling even faster. The rippling of the water against the boat grew louder as the craft picked up speed. The rasping sound came again. There was a distant thundering crash, and suddenly, shockingly, the nose of the boat rose sharply, then dipped again. Lief gasped as cold water slopped over the sides and poured over him. Barda stirred and groaned. The goblins glanced at them, but did not stop paddling for even a second. The boats rose and fell sickeningly once more, and now Lief could see great waves of red water heaving around them, clearly visible over the sides of the boat and becoming larger every moment. It was as though they were caught in a storm, yet there was no wind. There was only that menacing rasping noise and the dull thundering that was growing louder, and which Lief now recognized as the sound of waves crashing on land. Land! He tried to sit up, but fell back again immediately as the boat rose over yet another wave and slid down the other side. Wallowing in cold, foaming water, he struggled to get up again. "Be still!" cried one of the goblins angrily. He and his companions were almost knee-deep in swirling water, but still they were paddling with the same fierce concentration as before. Huge red waves were towering over the boat on all sides now, but the goblins looked only ahead, their long noses twitching, their pale eyes staring short-sightedly. And then, quite suddenly, came a sound and a feeling that made Lief shout with relief. The bottom of the boat was scraping on land. The goblins threw down their paddles, leaped into the water, and began dragging the boat out of the waves, calling for help. Bruised, shaken, and shivering, Lief and Barda crawled to their knees. The goblins were pulling the boat onto muddy land that rose out of the swirling water. Other boats were nearby, tied to what at first seemed strangely shaped trees, but which Lief soon realized were huge, branching, scarlet fungus. Dazed, Lief looked around him, trying to take in what he was seeing. Hills of red and brown fungus trees, a few nearest the water broken or uprooted by the force of waves. Orderly fields where rows of some sort of crop showed above streaming water, and, beyond the mud of the shore, a village. Waves had crashed over the low wall that surrounded it, and the streets were flooded. Several goblins were running from the village, crying out in relief and welcome. Lief and Barda's rescuers, whose names seemed to be Clef and Azan, had plainly been anxiously awaited. But at the sight of Lief and Barda, there was even greater rejoicing, and eager hands helped them out of the boat. "Get them to safety, quickly," said Azan, bending to retrieve the swords from behind the boat's seat. Jostled in the center of the group, Lief and Barda were hurried towards the village. As they reached the wall, the rasping sound came again, this time rising to a high, harsh note that was painful to the ears. To Lief's surprise, the goblins slowed, and their tense faces relaxed a little. After a moment, he realized that the waves were no longer crashing against the walls. The crisis, it seemed, was over, at least for the moment. They entered the village and began splashing through empty, flooded streets lined with dwellings. The houses were all dark red or brown. Many had been damaged by the storm. In other cases, doors had simply burst open, allowing water to stream into the rooms beyond. Brightly painted bowls and pots, small pieces of furniture, even bedding and clothes drifted in the flood. Clef peered angrily from side to side as they hurried through street after street. "This is worse than I have ever seen it," he growled at last. "Why has Voron not proceeded with the giving?" "There has not been time," the goblin beside him said nervously. "The ceremony of preparation had to be begun again for the new gift, and it is not yet completed." "What does that matter?" called Azan from behind. That last call was the final warning. "Are ceremonies more important than our lives?" Barda gave a muffled exclamation. Lief glanced at him quickly, but Barda had not been listening. He was looking over the goblins' heads towards an open space at the end of the village where a crowd had gathered. In the center of the space, clearly visible as the crowd surged forward to greet the newcomers, was a tall cage. It was backed by a high wall and surrounded by a complicated pattern of red stones. And standing inside the cage, their hands bound behind their backs, were Glock and Jasmine.